All right. Hey, everybody. I'm just going to check really quickly and make sure that the video started for everybody. And if not, then hopefully you're going to be hitting play. Oh, there's an echo. I don't hear it, so I don't know. Anyway, we'll get this started, and then if there's an echo when Jeff is speaking, then we'll try and figure that out. But all right, looks like the video works, and yeah, not a lot of echo. A few people making jokes about how we start Entre Programmers, and we're live. All right, so we are day one, Angular Remote Conf. Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited about just the opportunity that we have to kind of be a global community and come together and talk about Angular. So we will go ahead and get started. Our first speaker is Jeff Whelpley. I don't know if he was planning on introducing himself or if he was planning on me doing that. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce him. And then if he has a slide for that, then he can expand on that from there. He's the chief architect at Get Human. He's an Angular Boston Meetup co-organizer, an Angular Air panelist. Yay, Angular Air. Plug for them, podcast listener. And he's working on the Angular 2 Universal team, which is also very exciting and very awesome. I don't know that that's what he's going to be talking about too much today, but I'm sure it's come up on Angular Air, and we did an episode on Adventures in Angular, so you can go check that out too. I'll go ahead and throw the ball over into your court, Jeff, and let you take it away.
Thanks a lot, Chuck. Can you hear me fine?
Yep.
And you can see the slides, okay?
Yep.
Okay,
this
great.
is the part where I mute.
All right, great. I will get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for letting me join, Chuck. I really appreciate it. And today I'm going to talk about the Angular 2 survey that I had sent out a couple months ago. Patrick JS and I came up with something just to try to get a feel from the community. And I wrote a blog post about it last month. This talk is going to go over a lot of the same content, but I'll get into a little bit more detail and talk about some of the stuff that's happened since I published that blog post, some interesting things as well. So when we first kind of came together to think about reaching out to the community to get feedback, it was something where we were actually targeting just people that were working on Angular 2 extensively. So there are a small community of people, the Ionic team, a couple other people that are using it day in and day out, and we were trying to get kind of some ideas of what other people are using in terms of what libraries, how they're setting up their app and that type of thing. But once I tweeted it out to start getting feedback, we ended up getting a lot more response than even I expected. I expected at most maybe a couple dozen people would have responded, but Brad was nice enough to tweet our link to our survey, and from there it just kind of exploded to the point where to date we've gotten over 2,300 responses. A lot of great feedback besides people who just answered the survey, a lot of people emailing both Patrick and I with additional comments and discussions. And so it's been really, really great. A lot of great information that hopefully today I can convey to you throughout this presentation. So in terms of the users and where they came from, like I said, initially we were trying to get just those people that were using it on a day-to-day basis. But once we kind of started expanding it, it was actually nice to see people from all different levels of experience who were contributing. We feel that we got a good mix of demographics of backgrounds, and that helps to get a feel for what people are thinking. But the one thing that we did have to change our mindset on is, instead of thinking of the survey results that I'm kind of going to go over as this is what people are actually using today. There are some people who that is true, that what they responded is what they're actually using today. But because Angular 2 is in alpha, not that many people are, definitely not 2,300 people are using it on a day-to-day basis for sure. So more than likely, you can view a lot of these results as what people are thinking about they will use as they start to transition to Angular 2 and a lot of these new technologies that are coming out. So it's still interesting, but I think it is incomplete. And kind of one of the things I talk about at the end of my blog post is that it'll be really interesting to do something similar to this survey again in another year once people are actually using it in the wild. But let's get into it. So there was 10 essential areas that we went over: transpilers, template syntax, template location, routing, data libraries, server rendering, editors, build tools, frameworks, and features. And of course, after I sent it out, there was a million other things we thought about that would have been great to get feedback on. But it's a tough mix to think about. You don't want people spending an hour filling out surveys. So I did try to limit it just to things that we thought were interesting at the time. So let's get into each one of these areas. And for each one, I want to talk about, the results, but also some discussion that various discussions that went on after the survey came out about both the way that the questions were framed as well as just, what people are actually using. Okay, first for transpilers. So this was really interesting. At first, the first like 500 or so responses, I think even Babel was ahead of TypeScript, and they were pretty even, but then TypeScript pulled away. And not necessarily surprising in that the Angular core team has been really promoting TypeScript. They use it internally. A lot of the background for Angular developers is traditionally thought of as more enterprise developers that are used to compiled languages using types, and TypeScript does feel natural to a lot of people who come from a Java or .NET background and that type of thing. And the one thing that I realized after kind of putting it out there, this was one of those questions that I got a lot of feedback outside of the actual survey result itself. And one of the biggest ones was, people questioning the kind of false dichotomy here of either TypeScript or Babel for your transpiler. In fact, there's some things in between that people have used, including this one where some people have, their ES6 JavaScript with types that using TypeScript to compile down to ES6 and then Babel to compile down to ES5. Now, why would you want to do this? This speaks to like kind of a larger discussion about, what are these transpilers, used for? So there is a lot of overlap in terms of functionality as far as transpiling goes for TypeScript and Babel. But the big difference is that TypeScript uses types, obviously. So the question in my mind has always been, why can't these work better together, TypeScript and Babel? Because there's such a great community forming around Babel, great tooling, and it is harder. I mean, you can do stuff like this, what's pictured here, to use a lot of the tooling built for Babel, but it just makes it harder. Like it's more mental overhead, using two different things, some inefficiencies there, and that type of thing. It's not ideal for sure. And so Max here from Ionic tweeted about this subject, and I've kind of done the same. And Jonathan, who is the lead of the TypeScript team at Microsoft, has kind of responded in both cases to the fact that they are actually actively trying to work out something with the Babel team of how they can integrate. What that actually means is kind of unknown, but I think this speaks to something exciting for the future, because a lot of people like the things that Babel does, really well, and some people like TypeScript, but they don't want to have like a completely separate tool chain or deal with working with both of them at the same time. So if there was some way that they can work better together, that would help, I think, the entire community as a whole. So there's nothing there definitive yet, but I do think that in the future, that nearly every big project will end up using TypeScript, because there is a lot of benefits when you're working on a bigger team to having typing there, strong typing, and when you're trying to communicate with a lot of other developers. And it is true that they are able to get Babel to integrate better with TypeScript, so that you're essentially just using TypeScript as either a plugin, or I don't know what you want to call it, because it's a little bit deeper than a plugin. The integration has to be. But if they're able to kind of work well together and you kind of get it for free, I just think it's a no-brainer when you work on a bigger project that you would use TypeScript in a lot of cases. But yeah, one thing on this, I didn't have the link, but we did have a good discussion on this TypeScript versus Babel in Angular Air. So I will post a link to that at the end as well. All right, template syntax. So which template syntax do you use? So the two options here, I gave kind of an example, but really what this is kind of in the longer form. The short syntax that Mishko kind of was really the main mastermind of on the right-hand side here, where you're using the square brackets for the bindings, or the parentheses for events. As opposed to on the left side, the alternative is using what's called the canonical syntax, which is, instead of the square brackets, you use bind dash or on dash. Now, on the left is much more familiar to people in the Angular 2 community, or the Angular 1 community today, which is why, obviously, so many more people are preferring that in the survey. But the interesting thing here is that all the people that are currently working heavily on Angular 2, at least this is anecdotally, there's no like hard evidence of this, but at least from what I anecdotally see, is that people use the short syntax more so than the canonical, just because once you're writing a lot, just the shorthand starts occurring more naturally. It may seem weird at first. It definitely does the first time you look at it, but that weirdness kind of goes away after you've kind of looked at enough code. And believe me, after you're coding this all day, you'll see it enough that it'll just be second nature. Now, there was a time when something similar like this happened, and it was when Angular 1 first came out. A lot of people, myself included, thought it was weird that you were using these custom attributes, ng app, ng bind, right? And the thought was, well, to make it valid HTML, you have to use what's in the HTML5 spec, which is data dash. So data dash ng bind. And interestingly enough, you actually can use the data dash does work with the new syntax. Like if you do data dash bind dash foo, for example. But why do you want to do that? There's no one that I've seen. I'm sure there are people that do it, but the majority that I've seen of examples online and many blog posts, no one, not many people, use the data dash today in Angular 1. And I think that's because, it's just extra characters that don't really provide value. The browsers, after IE6 really got killed, which was, I think, causing some of those problems, there was just no discernible benefit. The browsers are able to handle the just ng bind without bombing. And, as long as browsers are able to support, the square brackets, which they do, I think eventually, and this is, again, my sort of prediction that people will start to use the shorthand more. But one thing that was an interesting point that Grezergy, actually I don't know how to say this name, but what he brought up was the possibility of mixing, which is definitely makes sense. And when I talked about this with Patrick, he brought up one other example that sort of made sense in some cases, depending on how you feel. Like the shorthand syntax is below the pound item, but sort of when you look at things, VAR item does feel a little bit better, at least to me. So I think that it will be one of these things that's a little bit in flux as people start to use Angular 2. I do think for my prediction that, you know, shorthand will be what people use for the most part eventually, like start to converge on, with some possible exceptions. I think in a year's time or so, there'll start to be kind of a best practice that kind of everybody converges on. That, you know, if it's, for example, you know, most bindings, I think for the most part, bindings people will end up using the bracket. But maybe for something like this, you know, the VAR is used instead of pound or something like that. So I suggest, even if it feels weird, try it out. See after a little while of building apps how it feels, and keep an eye out for what other people are doing as a lot of other people start to build on Angular 2. Okay, template location. So clearly, not many people have picked purely doing inline. Most people either just using the external file or a mix of inline and external. So this is an example of using an inline template. And when you look at this, some people hate this. They look at this, and I've had conversations with a number of developers after the survey results came out, and this just kind of like disgust them at their core or something. But I have the complete opposite reaction. I love this, and it just really speaks to me to be able to look at the styles, HTML, and logic all in one file for a component. I really like it. In fact, especially because this is a better implementation of what I've already implemented in my own Angular 1 code. So this is not the focus at all, but this is just a quick example of like something I have in Angular 1, which using my own custom framework, but just to point out that I sort of already do this, that I mix, you know, application logic and views, and I try to get styles in there too, all in one file. And it's not as clean and pretty as what you know, is in Angular 2 using a lot of the ES6 stuff, but that's why I'm personally really excited about this. And the other thing to bring up is, you know, a lot of people who were against using inline talked about how, you know, separation concerns, that, you know, among other things, when you are working with a designer, the designer has their HTML and CSS stuff, and the developer has their code logic, and that separation is good. But I urge all of you to read this great blog post by Eric Elliott, JSX Looks Like an Abomination. This is about React, but a lot of the things he says applies to Angular 2 with, you know, specifically what we're talking about here. And in particular, he talks about two things that, you know, inline, well, in their case, JSX, but for Angular 2 would be HTML.
Hey, Jeff, we're getting a pretty bad hum off of you.
Okay.
It's only when you talk, if that makes you feel any better.
That's not good. Hold on a second. Let me try to reconnect my mic. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Does that sound better?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. I appreciate you jumping in. So for Eric Elliott's article, highly recommend you read it. And you know, one of his main points, just kind of like, let's go back and look at this example again. one of his main points was, what do you think is easier for a designer? Like if they actually have the styles and the template like right there in their face, like then they don't have to look around in all over the place in your million CSS files, or if you have one file like a 10,000 long line long file or something. I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but any CSS that I've done has always been a hot mess. And the fact that you can just look in one small file to change a component's everything, in my opinion, makes it easier. And it's just a matter of like a little bit of training with your designers even. Now, the caveat with that is that you have to keep them small, which sometimes is hard. But that has always been a motivating thing for me to refactor. That once either the template or the application logic starts getting too big within a component, that's sort of your code smell of when you need to refactor it into smaller components. Sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes external files totally make sense. There are exceptions, but for myself, the general rule I follow is always trying to do stuff inline. Other people differ on this, and if I had to guess, I'm going to be in the minority, probably, as people use Angular 2. But I do think inline will become more popular. So even in the minority, I think as people start to use it more and kind of understand the benefits, it will become more popular. So I recommend trying it out. Okay, routing. So Angular 2, they've come up with a new router. The Angular 1 router, I think some people use, but most people that I know that use a routing library use the UI router in Angular 1. Angular 2, the Angular team has spent a lot of effort building a new router, and it has a lot of features that are going to be really great. The issue is that for a while, there were some bumpy times during the alpha of Angular with the new router. As people are starting to build stuff, there are people trying to build real apps right now in Angular 2, even in alpha, and they sort of need a router. And it's been kind of tough when there are issues. I mean, that's part of an alpha, right? But it's still been somewhat of a frustrating experience. I mean, the good thing is that it is getting better. A lot of the main issues that have been brought up have been solved or are in the process of being solved. And so the future for the Angular 2 router is bright, and it'll do very well, I'm sure. The UI router is not currently usable with Angular 2, but as you can see, a lot of people selected it because that's what they're used to, right? The Angular 2, or the UI router rather, team is in the process of a number of refactorings, and basically their plan is to change the UI router so that it's totally agnostic, so that it's not even it doesn't even have a hard dependency on Angular at all anymore, Angular 1 or 2, and but it can be used by both of them. So it's really interesting, some of the work that they're doing. And I think Nate, a friend of mine who's the main maintainer of the UI router, has a great quote, which I think encompasses this particular part of Angular pretty well when it comes down to picking which router you're going to be using. That when it comes down to it, it's going to be, does your brain and what your app requires fit better into a state machine or not? So the Angular router, the new Angular 2 router, is not really of that paradigm. It's not of the state machine paradigm. It's has a lot of features. It can do a lot of amazing things, but a lot of it's it's always URL based. It doesn't have the concept of this totally agnostic from the URL, this concept of a state machine. And so I'm not going to get into the details of state machine here, but definitely, I suggest, my recommendation would be to kind of look at that particular aspect when you start to think about what you want to use. And by the time that Angular 2 goes live, both the Angular 2 new router, the component router it's called, and the UI router should be available for you to use. So I do think that both options will thrive. So data libraries, this was kind of like a broad question. There's obviously a lot of different libraries. We had a whole bunch of people enter various things in the other option. The two big ones are RxJS and Immutable.js. And we've been fortunate enough to have a lot of people on Angular Air talking about these different libraries. In the upper left-hand corner is Matthew Podwaski, who is the author of RxJS. In the upper right-hand corner, just this past week, we had a great discussion on Immutable.js, and Jafar on the lower part came on to talk about Falcor and also Observables, as part, and RxJS as part of that. Basically, I do think, in short, that Observables will dominate, and as a result, RxJS. And the reason is, I think that Immutable.js is going to be really popular for sure because of React and a lot of the mentality of React of using immutable objects. But the background of a lot of people coming into Angular and people using Angular today is more suited to the kind of observable side of things, using observables in your views, because that's the same type of mentality that is used for like the dirty checking stuff today, that you're sort of getting this feedback when something changes. Observables is, in my opinion, just a better version of that. And RxJS is a very good library kind of built on top of observables. One note is, in addition to that, is that even if you are using Immutable.js, you likely will end up using observables in addition for things like HTTP calls. Angular Core has HTTP, the HTTP module uses observables so that you can kind of control the flow of either replaying a transaction, canceling it, all of that type of stuff. So for that it's really great, and regardless of which you use. But in both cases, it is interesting to note that both something like RxJS and Immutable.js fits in really well with Angular 2 with the change detection system, where you can kind of give the change detection system a strategy for how you're managing your data, and that will better optimize your code, because once the new change detection system knows, for example, that you're using observables, it doesn't have to do as many checks of the data itself. It knows that the observable library will notify it when a change has been made. So both the use of observables and Immutable.js are big performance optimizations in Angular 2. Okay, server rendering. So this is a big subject for me and for Patrick as well, obviously, because we work on the universal team within Angular to build out server rendering with Angular 2. I gave a talk at Angular U in the beginning of this summer that you should definitely check out. Goes over all the details of this. But in short, if I had to boil that talk down to just one slide, the reason why server rendering is important and why we're excited about getting it into Angular 2 is because of the performance gains, especially with the initial page load, where most web apps today typically take 3 to 7 seconds for that initial page load, and that's just kind of way too long. Some people are kind of used to it, but especially if you have a publicly facing app, it just causes a lot of user experience issues. And having a view that's rendered on the server will make that a lot easier. The key thing with what we're building in Angular 2 is that for the people that don't care about that much, they just want to get the performance gains, we're building in a way that it should come for free, basically, that you don't have to do much configuration or anything. Just with the code that you write, it will just, you'll be able to set up a couple things and it'll just work. And then for people who are more into this of like how you share data between the client and the server and various caching options, there will be a number of different, more advanced options. So going back to the percentages here, there's already a lot of people that say that they think they will use it. I think that it will become even greater, and really I think it will become ubiquitous just because it will, maybe not for the very first release, but we can already see the writing on the wall that it will be something that will just work out of the box, and you won't need much configuration. And so therefore there is a benefit to getting that performance gain, and most people will end up using it. But we'll see. That's just my prediction, and I'm fairly biased with that. Okay, editors. Everybody loves their own editor. There's like religious wars over discussions of this sort. I don't necessarily have strong preferences. I use WebStorm myself. I don't have like strong preferences to you have to use this or that. I do think the Visual Studio Code is really good. I've used that a little bit as well with a lot of the TypeScript and Angular 2 stuff I've done. But to be honest, I think a lot of editors have just done a really good job of already implementing Angular 2 features, and it's only going to get better. You know, if you look back at this example of a component, one thing you'll notice is that up here we declare directives. Now this is something that catches a lot of people when they first try out Angular 2, that they're not used to explicitly declaring the directives that they use in their template, and then it causes some error. And at first they're kind of like, why do you need to do this? This is just like extra typing and that type of thing. But there's a very good reason for this, and it's tied to kind of the editors. It's that, you know, by being explicit, you can build much better tooling around your development. So you can have the editor guide the user that, hey, you can't use ngif here. Like, you didn't actually add the core directives or whatever directives to your view. And also, there are performance things as well. When the framework can make assumptions about what's going to happen because everything's explicit, it's easier to do performance optimization. So for those two reasons, it is actually a good thing to have these. And I think that once you see this sort of next generation of editors, like having a lot of the advanced features to do, really advanced autocomplete and that type of thing, people are really going to be amazed. I think that I could see and envision a sort of time when you have a Resharper-like tooling for Angular, which is crazy because for those of you that are from the C# world and use Resharper like writes your code for you practically. Like, there's so much you could do because obviously it's compiled language, and you probably can't get to that level, with JavaScript. There are kind of limitations. But I do think that there's going to be, we have not reached the limits yet of the sort of crazy power that editors are going to be able to have, once this comes out. So I really look forward to that. For build tools, not surprising that Gulp is kind of in the lead. Everybody that I have worked with and know usually uses Gulp. For the other tools, one thing, if you are not familiar with like System.js, you probably should become more familiar with that. That's with the ES6 module loading system that's used with Angular 2. There is no module loader natively built within browsers, so you have to either package up all of your code, all your modules and components into just one package, one file download, or you have to use something like System.js, which will knows how to kind of pull the files, pull the modules as they're referenced. We had Guy Bedford on Angular Air. This was like one of my favorite episodes. Guy is super smart and has done a lot of work for all of us, really, in building both System.js and JSPM. I highly recommend this episode. But I've also been getting into Webpack lately, and It's great. If you haven't used Webpack, which is a module bundler, it's I mentioned you have these separate files of your Angular 2 code, and when you actually deploy, you want to like package it up into one file. And Webpack just has some amazing features for letting you do that. In fact, if you aren't familiar with Webpack, I highly recommend Kent C. Dodd's Angular and Webpack for Modular Applications series on egghead.io. He's coming up next, and he's great, so I just wanted to give him a quick plug. And yeah, prediction Webpack will be your best friend. As you get into these things, even if you aren't familiar with a lot of the module building, module packaging tools, you will be once you start getting into Angular 2. All right, frameworks. What other frameworks other than Angular 1 do you use today? And I mean, jQuery is obvious. I mean, it's so ubiquitous, and even if you're using Angular, there's people are always using other jQuery plugins and that type of thing. I mean, maybe it was surprising that it was so high, like over half the people use jQuery. That's actually really high, but I'm not total shock, right? And so the next one, that the none option there, it's kind of cut off, but it says no, none. I only use Angular. So there's a good number of people that literally don't use any of these other frameworks, just use Angular. But the other biggest one besides that is React, and that's not surprising either, because there has been a pretty big push by React and Facebook kind of marketing React over the course of the past year and a half, and people love to write about, to talk about Angular versus React. I mean, I love to like talk about it and that type of thing, just because I think it's kind of interesting, and but I don't get as fired up as some people, because it's sort of almost religious about it as some people. In fact, I found that a lot of the people using Angular 2 have a really strong respect for React and don't view it as a this versus that at all. I don't know if I could say the same on the other side, but I do think that a lot of what's in Angular 2 was heavily influenced by the ideas within React. And if you are coming from that mindset that it speaks to you, the thing that I tell other people that are kind of looking at this type of thing is that you can do pretty much everything that you can do in React, you can do in Angular 2. And obviously, it's not the big difference is that React has been in production ready really for a little while, and Angular 2 is still in alpha. So a lot of the tooling around and that type of thing is not quite the same. But I think as you kind of move forward, you can feel confident about continuing down the path of Angular 1 to Angular 2. Now that said, one thing that's kind of interesting with this dynamic is that at the very least, because there is a kind of gap between Angular 1 and Angular 2, it's not like okay, download the latest version and recompile. Like even with a lot of the stuff that they're coming out with now, there is some level of changes that you're going to have to make in order to go from one to the other. So that's given everybody kind of pause to, okay, what should I be using moving forward? The thing that I found is that the Angular core team is not necessarily scared by this, and people who have used Angular 2 heavily are not either, because they know that it's a really good framework. It is an improvement of Angular 1 for sure, and can go toe to toe with anything that React has. So I would encourage everyone to. It's actually a good thing to be familiar with other really good frameworks. So it would be a good thing for you to kind of look at both. But my own opinion is that Angular will kind of maintain its dominance that has frankly slipped a little bit in the past year, as kind of with the whole uncertainty around Angular 1 to Angular 2. And React kind of really doing a good job in a number of areas. So it definitely has slipped, but I think that it will come back really strong, as Angular 2 moves into kind of full release. And finally, for features, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't even list here for features for Angular 2, and it was kind of interesting to see some of the stuff that people chose. I mean, one of the things that I talked about in the blog post, though, related to another blog post that I'd written last year after NG Europe, which was sort of a mock post about how much people hate on Angular sometimes, and specifically that pretty much every argument against Angular 1 boils down to these kind of 4 different things. And so the interesting thing, looking at kind of the features with Angular 2, is how they sort of match up to these often perceived deficiencies in Angular 1. So for subpar features like routing and model layer, there is a infinitely better router that will be within core of Angular 2, and there is going to actually be a model library. So actually, I didn't mention it earlier. You can use RxJS or Immutable.js or whatever other data library with the change detection system, but they are actually building an Angular data. As part of the Angular data project, they're building a data library that will be within Angular core as well, that will be able to do some pretty cool stuff, based off of observables, and be able to have a lot of the stuff that people look for, with something like an Ember data, similar, for the people that are familiar with that. As far as some of the missing features, I already mentioned server rendering that will be in there, and for async loading, this is something that is pretty cool part of Angular 2, that components are loaded asynchronously, and it's kind of hard to appreciate that until you really get into Angular 2 more, but this does make it more flexible, and it opens up the doors for different lazy loading options that are not ready yet, but are kind of in the works. For the third one, cumbersome or confusing APIs, the service factory provider, that's like one of the top Stack Overflow questions, I think. And there's just a lot of things that have been simplified. Like, that's one thing, that there are new concepts that obviously you have to learn something new with Angular 2 in certain areas. But I think what you find, if you took somebody who didn't know either Angular 1 or Angular 2, and you tried to teach them one of those two, Angular 2 would be much, much easier to teach than Angular 1. Just so many of, like, I'm just taking the service provider, factory provider thing. They've unified everything to just a basic ES6 module with, a couple really simple annotations, but or decorators, but much simplified concept. And as far as dependency injection, that is simplified as well, that you don't have to have the bloated syntax of like the array with all the strings for the parameters, so that you don't mess up minification. Just various things like that, which just are nicer APIs, much more simple to understand. And then finally, for the fundamental design decisions, one of the biggest things that people complain about is with dirty checking and that it's slow, that type of thing. Now, there have been a lot of like really interesting blog posts after ngConf last year, one by Gleb Bamatov, a couple others, that talking about how, even this isn't necessarily, it's kind of like one of these popular misperceptions that itself is slow, that there are always ways to make Angular 1 faster, and that it can be really efficient. But the thing you can definitely say is that there are a lot of potential pitfalls you can fall into, with different performance stuff related to, dirty checking and some of those fundamental design decisions within Angular 1. The good news is that with Angular 2, a lot of that has been cleared up, especially with the really advanced change detection system, that is really awesome. Is flexible, that you can have, like I mentioned, the observable or immutable data types as well, and it just makes things that people did complain about before just non-existent in Angular 2. My prediction there is just very simply that you are going to love Angular 2. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it, guys. That's all I had, and I am going to be around for questions. Feel free to post in the chat room, or if you don't reach me now and you see this later or something like that, you can reach out to me on Twitter.
Yeah, so there's the questions and topics on, I'll turn my camera on even. There are questions and topics on the Crowdcast page. And so if you click on those, you can upvote questions, you can ask questions. Feel free to put your questions in there and vote for the ones that you want to get answered first. And then we'll let Jeff answer those questions here for a few minutes.
Cool.
You've already got 4 in there, so you can just go for it if you want.
Chuck, I don't have them in front of me. Can you read to me by chance? Sorry.
So the first one, the top one, is it says, looks like Angular 2 solves a lot of reasons that people left Angular 1 for React for. Do you think that people will be moving from React to Angular 2 when it comes out?
That's actually a really, really interesting question, because it's something that Patrick and I have talked a lot about. It's the people that are from a Java and .NET background. I think there are things that get stressed within Angular 2, and especially with the use of TypeScript and that type of thing, which may attract some of them, like when they're not just thinking of like someone who's used to React. The one thing that is, I don't want to say like, it's hard to compare, because anything that you can do in one, you can do in the other. So like, it's not fair to say that it doesn't do this well per se. But what I would say is, and even like Ryan Florence and I have talked about this, that like when you're teaching people about React, a lot of times you focus more on teaching like more esoteric, like programming type of, like you're teaching like a lot of programming concepts, because it is more, you have to understand a lot of, like, for example, immutability, right? So immutability is like a computer science concept. It's hard for somebody who's not coming from that background to appreciate it necessarily. And my experience has been that when you're in like larger corporate environments, like I used to work at Wells Fargo, it would take me forever to try to explain, to try to like get everybody on board to really appreciate, something like, immutability and the benefits and that type of thing. It's a much easier sell when you have, this is where like, even though you can do Angular 2 in that, using immutable, using the React kind of ways of doing things, the way that most people are going to use it is probably more like the, not only using observables, using like TypeScript, using classes and stuff that basically aligns with that way of thinking of like, the Java.NET developers. So I do feel that in the enterprise environment, you will see more people, and again, just my opinion, but you will see more people still opting for Angular 2, even if they started to look at React, just because of what I just mentioned. In other cases, I don't know. I'm not sure if I can think of a reason, because React is a good framework, but I do think if somebody hasn't used either one and is coming in, I think that is kind of an even game. Like I think that will be just as good of a chance that a person who hasn't experienced with either, that they would like either one of those. Hopefully that answered that question.
Yep. The next question is, do you think there will be an officials in quotes, version of these various preferences, or will people need to know them all as they work with different code bases?
So look back at what happened with Angular 1, that there are various options, the way people can use Angular 1. And I think in the very beginning, it was a whole hodgepodge, but now it's pretty matured, so that there is, like, if you look at like John Papa's style guide and there is sort of this best practice way of doing things for building Angular 1 apps, for sure, that people have like talked about a number of times. Like a lot of blog posts I see on like Angular 1 best practices, there's a lot of similar things that are said there. And so I think the same thing will happen with Angular 2, that, you know, initially it will be people using stuff all over the map. But, you know, within a year, maybe more, I think there will be some convergence on what most people use. But even then, you'll still have people using other stuff. I mean, that's one thing that I think is great about flexibility, that it works well with, you know, different variations. But it is also nice to have something that most people use. And I think that will eventually happen. I don't think that'll happen for a little while, though, like at least another year out.
All right. The next question is, any opinions about other framework actor of the next future, Aurelia, and integration of Angular with Polymer for web component parts?
Yeah, okay. Two good questions. So yeah, Aurelia is another framework that built by former Angular 2 core member Rob Eisenberg, and there is a lot of similarities. In fact, there's sort of an ongoing like inside joke that, you know, when somebody publishes something on one project, either Aurelia or Angular 2, a lot of times you see on the other project soon thereafter they have something similar. You know, clearly they're sort of tracking and there's a lot of similarities, but there's also differences in some approaches, some of the way that they feel. I think that someone who's coming from an Angular 1 background who looks at both, depending on some of their kind of internal preferences, they may prefer one or the other. Just like one example among others is that Aurelia is much more convention-based than Angular 2. Like Angular 2 is explicit. You kind of have to define everything and doesn't like assume anything for you, whereas Aurelia is more concise and but you have to kind of agree with their conventions. I mean, you can overwrite them and that type of thing, but that's just sort of the mindset, and that speaks to different people in different ways. So yeah, I mean, you should try both. I mean, I think that there's more features, more things in the Angular 2 world that will, you know, at least attract more people. But there's definitely use cases where, you know, people will like either one. And then what was the second? There's a second question in that.
Integration of Angular with Polymer for web components.
Yeah, Polymer. Yeah. So one interesting thing there is that Angular does work well with Polymer components. Like in other words, when you author a web component in Polymer, it's very easy to use that in Angular. But the one thing to be aware of is that you can't do the reverse. You can't author web components in Angular 2. And actually, that's been this thing that in the survey, I forgot to point this out, but, you know, a lot of people picked for one of their favorite features web components. And the thing I pointed out in the blog post, because I follow up with people and talk to them about that, and what I realized is that they aren't really talking about web components per se. There are some people that are specifically, you know, thinking about that, but that's like a minority. Most people are thinking more in terms of the component-driven architecture, like being able to create things in a component way, and that is powerful. Like that abstraction, the component abstraction in Angular 2, and it's very similar to the kind of component in React, by the way. Helps in your development a great deal and is powerful. The whether or not it runs natively in the browser is not a big deal right now, frankly, because the support for it is not huge, and only recently has Polymer, you know, fixed like a lot of performance issues that were there. But in the future, I think that there are a lot of possibilities. I mean, it's the thing where Angular 2 has set itself up so that when like actual web components, there is a discernible benefit in the future, then it's in a position that it's well leveraged to kind of like take advantage of that. But in the near term, most people aren't going to actually care or really use native web components at all.
All right. The next question is, could you turn off screen sharing so we can see your face?
Oh.
Instead of the two little kids.
Yeah.
That's my face.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. All right.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. The next question: can you give us a brief overview of what Angular 2 stack and toolset will look? What your Angular 2 stack and toolset will look like given these results?
Yeah, that's a good question actually too. And I've been going back and forth. Actually, I was for a little while not going to use Angular 2 in my, or sorry, not use TypeScript in my Angular 2 development for work. I was kind of preferring a lot of the Babel and related tool chain, but I sort of changed course in that. I am starting to use TypeScript just a lot more, and I am starting to perform it with the possibility of sort of that integration that I talked about. I feel more comfortable kind of going down that route. So I'm going to gulp, TypeScript. What was some of the other stuff that's in there? Trying to remember. I use all inline templates, like I mentioned. I have a heavy preference for server rendering, obviously. That's the big items. Remember if there's anything else. If you guys have a specific question, I don't mind laying it out. And maybe actually in the notes afterwards, I'll write in more detail, like the full stack of the stuff that I'm building right now for work.
Yeah, we're gonna have a community forum, so you can just post that in there on this talk.
Okay.
All right. The next question: will the slides be available after the fact?
Yeah, I'll post them right after. Definitely.
Okay. And the last one is, I'm sure you're going to share this. I asked this at the beginning of the thing, but is the survey available, and are the results public somewhere?
Yep, definitely. I'll post the link. You can still take the survey if you want. I kind of didn't close it down because I'd be interested in kind of how people continue to respond over time. But yeah, I'll post links to the results and everything. Actually, yeah, you know what? That's a good point. I haven't actually posted a link anywhere to the actual results that you can track. So I just my blog, which you should read as well. But I'll post a link to the actual results as well.
Yeah, there's a link in the comment to what looks like your blog.
Yeah.
But we had a few people comment that those numbers aren't even the same as the ones you're sharing now. So.
Yeah, because they changed. So that's why I'll put it to the actual Google form thing.
Okay, cool. Well, looks like you've got all the questions answered. Great talk. Everybody, if you want to give him wild applause in the chat, I guess. We are going to hop over. Oh, one more question. Jeff, what does your shirt say?
Oh, sorry. It's my Get Human shirt. So this is my company, the symbol for my company. It's to help people with customer service problems. If you ever need to get in touch with the company.
Yeah, his beard looks like my beard. That Get Human guy. Anyway, all right. Well, we'll get ready for Kent C. Dodds, who is up next. And thanks again, Jeff.
Thanks a lot, guys.
All right, now I hit the big red button.